Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Mr. Terry as I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on the internet. Alright, today's video comes from our awesome patrons over at Patreon. And in this week's poll, they voted for this video, What If Britain Never Conquered India by Alternative History Hub, a channel that I've frequented and has a lot of thought-provoking questions of what ifs in history. What if this had or had not happened? What effect it would be? So this is, I think it'd be really cool. This is pretty recent. Looks like it just came out about last month or so. So that will be interesting to go ahead and jump in here. So if you would like to vote in future polls, you could consider becoming a Patreon member. Right now it's at $1 a month, or you can do $5 a month to get some Discord benefits and stuff like that. But if that's something you'd like to get involved in, there's a link down below. Now the original video will also be linked down below. It's important that you go over there, give it the view time and all that stuff, and sub to them if you want to, which I highly encourage it, because this is fun stuff to talk about and gives us good reason to have discussions and stuff like that. So again, the question is, what if Britain never conquered India? And context here, I guess, just real briefly, is India is basically the most valuable colony that there has ever been for the very few people that have ever actually, foreign group people that have ever come in and had influence there. And for Britain, it was known as the crown jewel of their empire. At the height of their empire, India was their most valuable colony, far more than the Americas or anything like that. And if they had not conquered it, of course, the British Empire would not have been the largest empire in history, which is what it once was. So what if it had never conquered? First thought would be maybe somebody else does it. I mean, they had fought off the French for more control over there. And then before that, you had nations like Portugal and the Netherlands. But also very possible that India just doesn't get colonized by anybody. So let's see where they went, and let's see their line of logic, and we'll see what we think. And let me know what you think in the comments as well. All right, let's go ahead and get started then.
Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Sometimes history seems like very unrealistic fiction. Like a private company from a small island somehow is able to conquer one of the oldest civilizations on Earth.
British East India Company.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like fiction. But even with Britain's modern equipment and exploitation of alliances during a chaotic time, it's insane that the East India Company at all was able to ever get as far as they did. In fact, it's very likely had they made one wrong move, their venture could have easily gone bankrupt.
So these companies, the British East India Company is a company, right, a trading company that had basically government support, right? And they also basically had the ability and government support to pretty much defend themselves and conduct treaties and basically act almost like a nation. But yeah, so you're talking a massive company that also has a military. In my class, sometimes I throw out the term, think of Walmart with an army. And then you got the British East India Company, maybe. And that's obviously a very powerful force to be reckoned with.
But we're in our timeline. And even though the East India Company and even the British Empire is long gone, the echoes of their influence remain prominent today. So what if history had gone more predictably? India just isn't controlled by Britain. But for the sake of this being an actually interesting video, let's say no European nation actually conquers India.
Fair enough. So, you know, when you get things like the 7 Years' War, which was fought globally over places like this as well in India, you could then kind of hypothesize, yeah, maybe what if France had won the 7 Years' War? Then they were able to do that. So I guess it makes it easier, because then you go down another sort of rabbit hole, not really a rabbit hole, but a different branch of possible histories. And that's what you usually get with alternative histories, though.
Simple enough, right? In an alternate 18th century, the Mughals would still be on their way out, British or not.
Yeah.
The same cannot be said for the next major power, the Maratha.
Okay. Mughal Empire ruled for a good 200-300 years in India, and they were a group that had come in from up here in the northwest, where it'd be more like Afghanistan, an Islamic group that came in. And although the British eventually they were basically abolished, but they had lost their whole basically influence on there before the British fully came in. I mean, they overlap quite a bit, but they were already losing power. A lot of that came with the backlash they got from some of the rulers, like Aurangzeb, who was fairly oppressive, and that fueled a lot of the kind of the backlash against them, and was cracking the power that the Mughals had over India.
The Maratha Empire, as it was called, although it was more of a confederacy, rose out of rebellion against the Mughals. Really, it was fragmented between local rulers, hence the title. Without the British and Bengal waging war on the Maratha in 3 separate occasions, it's likely the Confederacy could have lasted at least another century or so.
By the way, this whole idea of maybe smaller groups ruling in India has generally been the history of India. India very rarely, can count on one hand, how much it has actually been unified. It's mostly a bunch of different states that got along or sometimes didn't.
Systems they set up brought in an era of prosperity, but were fragile. The power of the Confederacy was fueled by loyalty to individual charismatic leaders than any ideology or sense of unity. Yeah. Think like Charlemagne's empire or the Mongols. Once the old guard
think of themselves
dies,
as India,
the
but
bonds
by their
break
state.
down. The Maratha dwindle in size, and once again the subcontinent is a tapestry of small princedoms, sultanates, and empires. This isn't to say chaos or anarchy with constant warfare. It's simply going back to how historically India has always been, much like how Europe is split between different countries and nations. Okay, so maybe there would be some warfare. The point is, what the Mughals and British did was unite various different ethnic and language groups by force.
India might be the most diverse country in the world, and that's one big reason why it hadn't been unified. Plus, it's enormous and very powerful, so it's always been hard to do that. The Mughals were able to keep control in an interesting fashion because they were Muslim, which was a minority, probably around 15% maybe of the population. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but had for a lot of their time granted a lot of religious tolerance to the different ones to be able to keep their empire together. And like I was saying before, this Emperor Aurangzeb, he ended that. He was a very devout Muslim, wanted to institute religious taxes, and that was one of the reasons why their empire started to break up, was because of that, the kind of reversal on their tolerance policies.
An India formed without the boot of the British is one that is disunified and fragmented, but only because there isn't a need for that national identity of Indianness. It was a concept formed through the common interest to make the British Raj an independent state.
Sure.
In this alternate timeline, during the waves of 19th century nationalism, there becomes some vague notion among the elite and educated upper class
it was hard.
that a united India would be a good dream, but the reality is far harder to implement.
Well, it never has that too. Look basically what happened when Britain did, in the reality that we lived in, that Britain was in control, and on their way out, you got the different groups that were talking about what an independent India should look like, and you get, like an Indian National Congress and stuff. But then you especially got the fear from the Muslim side, who were fearful that they would basically be oppressed or dominate over by the Hindu majority, which started to bring up conversations of creating separate nations by the two different state system. And that's of course where we get Pakistan and India, where India was generally kind of like thought of to be a place for Hindu Indians, where Pakistan would be for Muslim Indians.
Without a common enemy, any unification India would go through would be a bloody process. Just look at Germany and Italy.
And it was.
Those countries are far smaller
Millions
than India.
died.
Any unification of
after
India,
the British
if
left.
successful, isn't seen through a national identity, but just a successor to the Mughals. When this concept of national identity does eventually arise, it'd be among smaller regions, with perhaps even already tiny Indian states balkanizing themselves just like Austria-Hungary did after World War I. This leaves a question. Would India ever unify? This is going to sound counterproductive to the points I just made.
Well, are we not counting what actually happened in history with the India-Pakistan split as unifying?
But yes, maybe. Just not in the way that we have India today. India isn't ever officially a country, but the concept of India is created near the modern day as a system of alliances much like the EU.
And the South
Cooperation
rarely
is
was
seen as
unified
much
with the
more
North,
beneficial
even
and
at their
keeps their
best,
states from
most
being
unified
trampled
times.
on by larger outside influences. However this is implemented, the concept of this alternate India is
Love
born
that
without
architecture.
the overall threat of a European empire, meaning situations like a Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India don't happen. There would be various states that either favor Islam, Hinduism, or perhaps just have a mix of both. And
I mean, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility that they'd still have something like that on their own. Maybe as a result of, again, a lot of infighting. Or just the Muslims, they get overrun. They just get overrun, and that could have happened too.
And since the British
they were a
don't
minority.
create what is now Pakistan's western border, the territory of the Pashtun is never simply split in half. Still is going into a world on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. So what do?
Interesting here, Indian Industrial Revolution. I'll go and preface this with something that I think follows. And you can bring in China with this. A question that people have is, when India had the wealth, the resources, and an educated class, with having all that, why didn't the Industrial Revolution start there? Why somewhere small like the British and stuff like that? Well, what would make more sense is the fact that they don't need to industrialize. They don't need to, even independent of like the British or something like that. Meaning, being that one thing they have a lot of in a place like India or China is workers. They have labor, right? You have labor, and you have cheap labor. You don't need to industrialize. You don't need these practices that would increase efficiency time in production. Something like textiles. India was the leading producer of textiles for basically all of world history, especially cotton. And in fact, if you can think of it this way, if industrializing had happened in India, it would have put millions of people out of work. And it's just not something you needed. Where you look at like Britain, for example, which has the other stuff. They had a stable government. They had wealth that was already from other colonies and slave trade and stuff like that. But what they didn't have, of course, was the labor power as compared to somewhere like India or China, which has the biggest populations in the world. There's an incentive to have labor-saving devices. Where in somewhere like India, no. In fact, that could hurt the economy in a lot of ways. So that's something to think about. Now, for what they're going to talk about in Indian Industrial Revolution, I'm interested to see, are they going to see them as like a forerunner of Industrial Revolution or more of kind of what the same was?
India would not modernize like Europe did,
I
even
agree.
if it was not under the control of Europe.
At least not at that time.
This has nothing to do with culture or philosophy, but simply population and economics. Northern India has always been one of the most heavily populated regions in the world, and with such a high population, labor was cheap, wages were low, everyone needed a job. Meanwhile in Britain, the population was far smaller, and not only did they have an abundance of coal to fuel new innovations, but higher wages actively encouraged business owners to invest in machines that would replace their workers and save money. Innovation, especially with industrialization, came out of the need to make profit and avoid those high wages. India didn't have this luck. A textile machine would put far more Indians out of work than Europeans. Laborers out of work due to machines revolt against their rulers.
Oh man, it'd be
Rulers
huge. I mean, there were even little revolts and stuff in places like Britain. I mean, look at like the Luddites, a group like that. Interesting. But yeah, I mean, this is totally what history is kind of telling us a bit. Because now, the Eurocentric counter argument to this was, if you're asking the question, like if you were to ask somebody in Britain, for example, or another early industrial time period in one of these nations, why did you industrialize while these other nations didn't? Then you might get some of the racial, educational type of argument saying that, well, the British are they're smart enough to figure that out. You know what I mean? These other people, they're incapable of it. You know what I mean? But we know the factors for that are far deeper, and I agree with what he's saying.
don't want that. For a while, India wouldn't have industrialized as fast as Europe or East Asia. However, at least compared to our timeline, it would be far more wealthy. It'd still have the products like cotton, silk, textiles, and tea to sell to traders, It's just this time, the profits would go to the hands of the rulers, or at least merchants, in Indian states themselves.
And who it's going to be who owns that land too, because it doesn't matter if you industrialize. Industrialization doesn't give you natural resources. You still have to have that. That's why what you also see in line with the Industrial Revolution is also the biggest increase in imperialism. Because if you're Britain, you need, yeah, you have factories to make stuff, but you need those raw goods. You need the like cotton, for example, right? You got to have the raw materials. You still got to have all the tea. You got to have all that stuff that's not going to be found there. So you still have the ability for a lot of wealth to be gained, right, by these states. And remember, they were really wealthy before the Industrial Revolution. Places like India, and the Mughal Empire was probably the richest empire of the day, and one of the richest empires in history, because of all these resources, and they were selling them to people all across the world, Europeans and other Asian nations alike. So the wealth is to be there. But yeah, it'd probably be more in the hands. Yeah, they're saying traders, but it seems like landowners would be a big thing. So almost like an aristocracy.
There is, however, one main downside to not industrializing: modern war.
Yep.
European nations could simply fight a war more efficiently. I think just as East Asia learned following defeats from Western empires,
Opium Wars.
industrializing allows you to have a modern military. And that'd be a
Sino-Japanese
question many
War.
states across the subcontinent would begin to ask themselves.
This is where this is where it hurts them. They were able to grow these militaries, which show up in these other nations in Africa and Asia. The European ones were very small, but completely able to make up for that because of their technological advancements, right? They were able to mass produce weapons and innovate new weapons and stuff like that would make up for their numbers. And that's why they are going to dominate. Again, it brings down the final Chinese dynasties. It puts the final dagger in the Mughal Empire in India.
Alright, I know it's absurd that the British just avoid India altogether, but in this alternate timeline, let's just say that their only relationship to India is mutual trade.
Sure.
This way, their market still gets those leaves without the whole conquering part. Simple enough, but buying and trading for goods from another party is far more expensive than owning production yourself. Without the EIC to force Indians to plant certain types of cash crops, prices go up. And in the mercantile world, having things like people planting food to survive or fairly dealing in a foreign market is just bad business, discouraging investment from home. So from an economic standpoint, the crown never has its jewel. That geopolitical...
That's what I was saying earlier, the crown jewel. India, that was the biggest. They're showing part of the their empire there. This would be after the American Revolution, so it used to be, the empire used to be bigger than this even too. But yeah, you got all this going on. This is also where you see the red parts where they said the sun never sets on the British Empire because literally it's daylight somewhere where the British were in control of. And this is again at one time was the largest empire, or was the largest empire in history. A little bit before this.
Position of Britain as the massive power it was in the 19th century is gone. Without Indian cotton, does the British textile industry just never grow? Well, no, it would still exist. It'd just be smaller, more...
Now let's keep in mind this. The Industrial Revolution was built upon the back of the textile industry. The textile industry was the first industry to industrialize, meaning the first one to have complex machines to save on efficiency, right? Things like looms, things where you can weave different, a whole bunch of threads at the same time, thus reducing the amount of people you'd have to do that. So the Industrial Revolution was built on the back of textiles. So what happens to the Industrial Revolution? It wasn't built upon that. What is it possibly going to be built on? Maybe it's still the same thing, right? But it's going to be far more expensive, which means the profits are going to go down. The Industrial Revolution doesn't grow as fast as it does. Big string of events right there.
More reliant on American imports. The raw goods the British economy receives is just shifted. The main change is profit. There are less cheap exports from India to take advantage of, which means less wealth to spend on things that do affect history. War, global policy, empire building. I could talk about this a lot, but we both know that you don't want me talking for 20 minutes about British textiles, so let's move on to something else. Without having access to the poppy fields of Bengal, the British don't have the leverage to sell opium to the Chinese market, or more specifically,
China's
create one of the
protected.
largest drug smuggling operations in history, because the only thing the Chinese would buy for the British was opium.
That, by the way, goes back to what I've been talking about before. China, India have all the resources they would ever need. They don't need foreign goods. They don't need them. And yeah, the British, that was the only thing they could get in there, was get some people addicted to opium and then sell it there. And then, of course, that leads to the Opium Wars when China wants to get rid of it and Britain says no because it's a huge part of their economy. Opium and sales, basically drug sales, made up like a fifth of the entire British economy or something crazy like that. So China, it has an impact on China. China would not have been able to be exploited by the British, thus leading to the end of their dynasties.
So yes, while there are no opium wars, I don't think this change would be that drastic. Britain still has that technological advantage, and could just barge in with their modern military and demand China concede to their demands anyway.
But if they don't have India, their industrial revolution doesn't happen in the way that it does, that allow them to develop more economically and technologically, that then they would be able to in turn into their imposing on China. So I do think they're a little bit more connected maybe than he's stating.
Remember that famine that killed 10 million Bengalese? Well, such a situation left the East India Company almost bankrupt. To save the company, Parliament implemented a tax on East India Company tea
Happened again in World
to
War
the
II in
Americas.
India.
The colonists did not like this, of course, and started smuggling Dutch tea instead in protest. Parliament allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, still at a tax. And to the colonists, this was seen as a monopoly on trade, and one that hurt local smuggling of Dutch tea. Long story, incredibly short, this was what led to the Boston Tea Party. In a weird twist of fate, if Britain didn't have India, there would never have been a Boston Tea Party. Does this change a lot for the American Revolution? No. There are still like 12 other reasons why America would have rebelled, but I thought it was an interesting fact and couldn't really fit it in anywhere.
Power without an engine.
Removing
Okay.
India from the British takes the engine out of the car. I don't know if there would have been an empire without it. It fueled the growth. And really, by me imagining Britain without India, it's the world without the British Empire, which is a whole other scenario in itself.
Sure, but they got involved in other places too outside of India, even without being propped up by India. It just wouldn't have been the empire that it will be. Maybe not the largest empire in history.
It could be a situation where the balance of European powers is shifted so much that the First World War never happens. Or perhaps if there is a great conflict, Britain isn't in the winning favor. As for India,
Well, industrialization, imperialism was one of the causes. It kind of fueled a lot of the nationalism and military alliances in that. So is World War I not going to happen? I don't know. Nationalism was already plenty strong before the Industrial Revolution. Europe has had that forever. So, I mean, you still might have one. Maybe not to the scale, of course, World War I was. If you're saying everybody would have been hit technologically a little bit. Because that's what made World War I so devastating, was the new technologies of war.
themselves into this modern world, the industrialization process would come eventually, dramatically shifting Indian society, but it'd be a change by India. It wouldn't be an India as we know it, but a system of alliances, all acting independent from one another, but occasionally uniting. An alternate timeline where really any path for the subcontinent is possible. Like I said, the only true thing to predict is millions don't die from famine. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Yeah. Patrons. Let's give it up for the patrons for all the history channels. Thank you. All right, guys. So, yeah, interesting things to think about. I mean, it almost looks like it's not as devastating of a change in a way, at least not clearly, like maybe some of their other alternate history like ideas that they had talked about. But nevertheless, yeah, it would be a big deal, especially for Britain, and maybe creates a little bit more of a balance of power in the world. China might be stabilized more, India would be. not as exploited European nations would stable or become a little bit more even as well. So you definitely wouldn't get that, I think, as much of that imbalance of power at the height of the imperial era that you got there, because again, India was the most profitable colony basically anybody has ever had in history. And so yeah, I guess a more even playing field in a way, and like they're saying, it might have helped a lot of things in there. It could have prevented more famines, maybe reduced the scale of wars, right, that ended up happening, which is definitely true there. So if you're saying, would the world have been a better place if Britain never conquered India? I know, I guess it always depends on who you ask, right? So anyway, interesting thoughts there to think about. What do you think? Put your comments down there. You can respond to other people. Join our Discord server if you'd like to get involved in that conversation as well. Lots of good things there. Again, I want to thank, just like they did in their video, my patrons that voted on this video and are supporting the channel with your small little monthly donations. They mean a lot, and I'm hoping it makes you feel a little bit more part of our community and what happens here, and we're all kind of going through this historical appreciation and learning all together. And that's the point here of what we're trying to do. So, all right, on the way out, a few things. Make sure you sub to my new gaming channel. Link is down below. I'm putting most of my gaming stuff over there. I do a lot of history games, a lot of just gaming stuff in general. Do that. We got some fun stuff going there, trying to grow that channel up a little bit as well. Link to Patreon is down below. Join if you want to get involved. Same with Discord and Teespring. We got shirts up, history shirts down there, so you can check that out and rep your history love out there in public. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and end here, and we'll see you next time. Bye.